Soon afterward, the armies of Midian, Amalek, and the other neighboring nations united in one vast alliance against Israel. They crossed the Jordan River and camped in the valley of Jezreel.
Then the Spirit of God came upon Gideon, and he blew a trumpet as a call to arms. The men of Gideon's clan, which was called Abiezer, responded. Men who had recently wanted to kill him were now ready to serve under his command. He also sent messengers to the tribes of Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali. Gideon summoned their fighting forces, and all of them responded. Then Gideon said to God, "If you are really going to use me to save Israel, as you have promised, prove it to me in this way. I'll put some wool on the threshing floor tonight, and if in the morning the fleece is wet and the ground is dry, I will know that you are going to help me." Gideon's fleece would forever be an example of putting God to the test. To some, this is fine. After all, we're just human beings and we want a sign from God that we're moving in the right direction. To others, fleeces should never be put out, and people should just trust God from the beginning. But God showed no anger with his request. When Gideon got up the next morning, he pressed the fleece together and wrung out a full bowl of water. Then Gideon said to the Lord, "Please don't be angry with me, but let me make one more test. This time, let the fleece remain dry, while the ground around it is wet." Gideon anticipated that God might not be pleased with another test. But in his fear, this mighty man of valor needed a little more assurance. We can't blame Gideon because of his circumstances. But despite the intimidating forces of the Midianites, it would be better to fear the Creator of the universe rather than some unruly desert nomads. The Lord did as he asked. That night the fleece stayed dry, but the ground around it was wet with dew. Gideon and his army got an early start and went as far as the spring of Herod, where soon a test for the soldiers would be underway.
The armies of Midian were camped north of them, down in the valley beside the hill of Moreh. The Lord then said to Gideon, "There are too many of you. I can't let all of you fight the Midianites, for then the people of Israel will boast to me that they saved themselves by their own strength."
How was this going to look to the people? Their new leader, with 32,000 men, suddenly reducing his already outnumbered army. The Lord said, "Send home any men who are timid or frightened."
So 22,000 left, and only 10,000 remained who were willing to fight. But the Lord told Gideon, "There are still too many. Bring them down to the spring, and I'll show you which ones shall go with you, and which ones shall not."
So Gideon assembled them at the water. Then the Lord told him, "Divide them into 2 groups, decided by the way they drink. In group 1 will be the men who cup the water in their hands to get it to their mouths and lap it like dogs. In group 2 will be the men who kneel with their mouths in the stream." The smarter soldiers were the ones who drank from their hands, keeping their eyes up on the lookout for the enemy. The others just wanted to quench their thirst.
Only 300 of the men drank from their hands. All the others drank with their mouths in the stream. "I'll conquer the Midianites with these 300, the Lord told Gideon. "Send all the others home."
300 men versus 135,000. The Lord wanted the odds to be so bad, no one but he could take the credit. During the night, with the Midianites camped in the valley, the Lord woke Gideon up.
Take your troops and attack the Midianites, for I will cause you to defeat them. But if you are afraid, first go down to the camp. Take your servant Porah if you'd like, and listen to what they're saying down there. You will be greatly encouraged and eager to attack.
This is the only place in the Bible where Porah is mentioned. The name means productive person, and if the Lord suggested taking him along, he must have been some sort of comfort for Gideon. So he took Porah and went down through the darkness to the edge of the enemy camp. The vast armies of Midian, Amalek, and the other nations of the Mideast were crowded across the valley like locusts, yes, like the sand upon the seashore, and there were too many camels to count. Thousands of tents were in the area, and Gideon and Porah just happened to overhear a very interesting conversation.
Gideon crept up to one of the tents just as a man had awakened from a nightmare, and was telling his tent mate about it. "I had this strange dream," he was saying, "and there was this huge loaf of barley bread that came rumbling down into our camp. It hit our tent and knocked us flat." The other soldier replied, "Your dream can only mean one thing. Gideon, the son of Joash the Israelite, is going to come and massacre all the allied forces of Midian."
That was a quick and gloomy interpretation by the fellow soldier, and Gideon must have been surprised. Not only did these mighty soldiers know his name, but believed he could lead a force that could wipe them out. When Gideon heard the dream and the meaning of the dream, all he could do was just kneel and worship God. He had watched the Lord perform the miracle on the altar, fleece test number 1, fleece test number 2, and now an outrageous dream where all works out in Gideon's favor.
Then he returned to his men and shouted, "Get up, for the Lord is going to use you to conquer the vast forces of Midian." He divided the 300 men into 3 groups, and gave each man a trumpet and a clay jar with a torch in it. Then he explained his plan.
"When we arrive at the outer guard posts of the camp," he told them, "do just as I do. When I and the other men in my group blow our trumpets, you blow yours on all sides of the camp, and shout, 'We fight for God and for Gideon.'" For God and for Gideon. The Bible doesn't tell us why Gideon threw his name in there. Was his ego on the rise? At least he gave God top billing. It was just after midnight and the changing of the guards, when Gideon and the 100 men with him crept to the outer edge of the camp of Midian.
Suddenly they blew their trumpets, and broke their clay jars so that their torches blazed in the night. Then the other 200 of his men did the same, blowing their trumpets in their right hands, holding the flaming torches in their left hands, all shouting, "For the Lord and for Gideon." Then they just stood and watched as the whole vast army began rushing around in a panic, shouting and running away.
The enemy didn't know exactly how many soldiers Gideon had, but waking up to the sound of 300 trumpet blasts, the smashing and crashing of 300 clay pots, and the sudden light of 300 torches was enough to melt the nerves of these most ruthless of villains. For in the confusion, the Lord caused the enemy to begin fighting and killing each other, from one end of the camp to the other, and many fled into the night. Gideon and his army watched as the Midianites did their work for them. No one had to draw a sword, and one of the most ferocious armies of the Old Testament fell anyway.
Then Gideon sent for the troops of Naphtali, Asher, and Manasseh, and told them to come and chase and destroy the fleeing army of Midian. Gideon also sent messengers throughout the hill country of Ephraim, summoning troops who seized the fords of the Jordan River at Bethany, thus preventing the Midianites from escaping by going across.
2 Midianite generals by the names of Orab and Zeb were captured. Orab was killed at a rock that would later be known by his name, and Zeb was killed at a winepress that would later be known by his name. The Israelites took the heads of these generals across the river to Gideon. They met a bad end, but at least they had a rock and a winepress named after them. The psalmist Asaph would later mention them in Psalm 83.